The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised.
Oh, how I wonder what it's like to relax. See the sky down under. Hope my plans collapse. Oh, how I'm under the surface of my tears, falling down asunder the meaning of my years.
This is True Crime XS.
When we started this, you and I thought, okay, maybe this is a fall or something happened to this kid where he either fell or jumped or there was an accident. But reading the autopsy report, clearly that's not what happened. So with all the other changes to the narrative, the autopsy changes a number of things. Tell me what you thought of the injuries, because I know it's hard for you to get through an autopsy report. You have to pay particular attention to it. And you're not big on kind of the squeamish side of it. What did you think?
So there's the initial autopsy report, and then there's a private autopsy report that's done subsequent to that, right?
Yeah.
And if you recall, it's very apparent to me a non-medical person who is very squeamish with regard to anything that has anything to do with the human body. It doesn't even have to be a non-living human body. But the very first thing that I questioned was the strap muscle bruising. And that is indicative of of manual strangulation, right?
Yeah.
Anytime you see that in any case, part of the difference that is notable to me is when you've got just that bruising as opposed to, a laceration indicating something there or a garrote or whatever on the outside. When you've got just that strap muscle bruising, we're talking about manual strangulation.
Correct.
Okay. And that comes into play in my mind because you cannot manually strangle yourself.
Correct.
Okay. And so the autopsy shows that. I did not see that mentioned in any of the conclusive statements made in any of the reports. I don't know about you. I'm sure you'd tell me if I missed it. But we have a situation where this young man was hit in sort of succession, causing extreme wounds to his skull, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and so at that point, he's been hit repeatedly, and that's going to render him unconscious or semi-conscious. This is taking him down.
Yes.
But while it has disrupted his conscious state, it has not killed him. And so he's still breathing. And if you think about it, somebody that is attacking someone, and, we don't know what the circumstances are, but it makes sense that somebody, I don't know if the instrument broke or what happened, why they stopped hitting him in the head, but then they went to cut off his airway with their hand, right?
Right.
Additionally, his pharynx was lacerated. And I was telling you that if a little child is running around with a lollipop in their mouth and they fall and they push the lollipop into their mouth all the way, it hits the pharynx. So that gives you an idea of where that is, right?
Yes.
And there is, on the left side of Jay's neck, there's a 1-inch laceration that has a contusion surrounding that 1-inch laceration that's 3x2.
Yeah, it's a big bruise. Yeah.
That's a big bruise. And I couldn't figure out what that was. However, and I'm not a medical professional. However, I feel like that is the quickest way to figure out how the pharynx got lacerated, and I feel like that may be a stab wound. And if you think about it, somebody who has a knife in their hand and they puncture and make a laceration hard enough because he's trying to kill this guy that is unconscious. The hand on the handle of the knife is what's making the 2x3 bruise.
Right.
Okay. And so so it's a very hard stab. This is a big leap from what has been mentioned in the rest of the reporting. I'm not sure why nobody else saw it. Now, I could be wrong about the laceration, but if I am interested to know what an alternative explanation for the pharynx being lacerated is. Because that's a very hard thing to lacerate independently of like a huge indication elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, like I said, we have a situation where we have a young man who there's signs of manual strangulation. He's got a lacerated pharynx. He's got a 1-inch laceration that has a 2x3-inch bruise on the left side of his neck. And to me, this is from the initial autopsy report, which was done just within hours of him being found.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay. And to me, the manual strangulation, the putting together those wounds to make it seem like it indicates he was stabbed in the neck, those are things that point away from an undetermined death to me.
Yeah, the pathologist agrees with you. Like, once the second pathologist comes into the picture, there's some changing that's done by the original pathologist. I would say not only was it done within hours of the death, the autopsy is prepared pretty quick. And I say that notwithstanding the fact that toxicology had to come back. But here's a little paragraph from the second autopsy report that supports what you just said, partly, but also points out that, like, this person is trying really hard to be sort of neutral about this whole thing. It just says that several other significant injuries were present, having clearly occurred prior to death. Specifically, there were injuries caused by a blunt object on both the left and right sides of the head, with fractures of the skull underneath. In both of those areas, there are multiple irregular areas where the skin has been torn, and they have an underlying fracture. In both of those areas, there was at least one, likely multiple blows by a blunt object, because it takes a minute to, leave the marks you're describing, and sometimes it's not on the first blow. There are injuries to the brain, which had swollen. That's a huge deal. Both sides of the head show like direct impact injury with application of blunt force. There's a blunt injury to the left side of the neck, which is what you're talking about. And to the point that there's tearing of the skin, there are a large area of bleeding into the soft tissue, and a fracture of the left side of the hyoid bone. Now, a hyoid bone in a 20-something-year-old person it's very hard to break it.
That also coincides with what I was saying about the laceration being on the left side, the 1-inch with the 2x3 bruise.
Yep.
So that coincides with breaking the hyoid bone and the pharynx being lacerated.
Correct. It goes on to basically say the pattern and the severity of these injuries is typical when someone is beat with a hard object. And then, they sort of go through the four things that can happen in a situation like this. And that is, it could be natural, could be accident, could be suicide, and they discount each one. Point being, this isn't a natural death. And the pathologist didn't totally disagree with the medical examiner, because they did say undetermined is an appropriate classification if the certifying doctor feels that there is a possibility of the death being due to a suicide or accident. And then they change direction and they say, based on the autopsy findings and limited knowledge of the facts of the case, accident seems unlikely because these injuries don't collectively indicate a jump or a fall from a bridge. Similarly, they say that suicide seems unlikely for the same reasons. And it's these head injuries and these neck injuries that they're basing all of this on.
Right. And I took it a step further, not being a medical expert, just having to have had to have looked at a lot of autopsies that I didn't want to be looking at to begin with, because I am so squeamish about it. I look at it a certain way, and even if the 1-inch laceration is a neck wound, is a stab wound, like, it is possible somebody stabbed themselves, right?
Right.
I find it unlikely he hit himself in the head, but I maintain, without question, you cannot manually strangle yourself in a way that shows up in an autopsy. Additionally, it can't be an accidental strangulation like with a rope or something, because that is different.
Right.
And so because I see these signs of a manual strangulation, to me, there is no other way that can happen but by someone's hand.
Right.
And someone's hand being on someone's neck like that is going to point to homicide. Even if they didn't mean to do it, right? Like saying accidental. This is not because a homicide is death by someone else, right? And notice that it's homicide. It doesn't necessarily say murder, right?
Yeah.
And so that is what struck me the most, was that, to me, the findings actually go beyond undetermined and logically conclude that with the signs of manual strangulation that are there, absent other ways it could have gotten there, the only thing that could have happened was somebody used their hand to try and cut off his airway. And that lends towards homicide.
Yeah, and so the way that we picture this going down, we don't know like where, when, why this is happening, but we picture it being the first blow essentially rules out us getting any real defensive wounds because it either knocks him unconscious or it stuns him to the point that like the rest of the blows can happen. You know, whether that's like an exact scenario, we don't know. But the idea is that the rest of the blows were kind of to put him out. And we don't know where the strangling happens in there. We just know that more than likely that strangling was them trying to kill Jay. Or
they were trying to cut his airway off.
Yeah. And that part, like you said, you can't manually strangle yourself. I don't know, I've run, before people jump on this, I've run a lot of scenarios here. You and I have talked about snowplows, car accidents, buses, being on the L. We have talked about so many different scenarios where we tried to make all of these things happen, and we just can't do it. Like, I went so far as to say, if he's in a precarious situation and he's got a camera strap around his neck and he's trying to get a shot of something and he gets hit by something that knocks him over the side and the camera strap causes an injury, none of them will account for all of these things happening to this kid. The only thing that accounts for it in any meaningful way is that he has an encounter with someone who assaults him. They continue that assault until they either dump him in the river or they kill him and then dispose of the body in the river. There is pulmonary edema listed in the autopsy. And for people who don't know, that's when you get fluid in your lungs. And it typically is found in drowning victims, so to speak. But it's not the only way that it happens. But there's this whole list of external evidence of injuries on the initial undetermined autopsy report. It gets to 11. And the bottom line is the 11th one doesn't bother me because it's post-mortem. These are the wounds that they think happened by him being in the water and potentially hit by a barge or a boat. and the propeller or the screw, making these post-mortem wounds on his thighs. But the other 10 injuries, it's very difficult to put all those things together and discount them. But when you add in the strap injuries, which is what we've sort of covered here, these injuries to his neck, as you said, you really only get those and the hyoid fracturing in a manual strangulation, meaning hands on a neck, around the neck, for the sole purpose of trying to cut off someone's air supply until they die. Typically, you would find under someone's fingernails DNA from trying to defend against that, but not when you've got these kinds of head wounds. And that's what makes us put the head wounds first.
Right, because he has no defensive wounds at all.
Right. And the body is in the water, so we lose a lot of things, but we don't lose these injuries. We don't lose the neck injuries, and we don't lose these head injuries. And they're not, like, these injuries are not small. One of them on the back of the right side of his head had a full 5-inch area covered. Like, they end up saying, like, the largest one is a laceration that's an inch and a half or just under, and the smallest one's about half an inch, but it's like multiple contusions and lacerations in this area. He's got lacerations on the right side of his forehead, and then he's got multiple lacerations on the left side of his head, along with the contusions that go with them, one of which is huge, which is probably the big first blow. It's just very difficult for me to read all of this. And I've read tons of autopsies over the years. Nothing about this like strikes me as a suicide. It would be a pretty big stretch for me to look at this and go, maybe it's an accident, because there's so many different things happening on so many different parts of the body. And typically in a fatal accident, you might see a bunch of little things happening. And I guess you could look at this and go, all right, these are little things, but they're really not.
I still feel like you're not going to get the manual strangulation absent like an additional laceration on the neck where something was pressing, like a camera strap or whatever. You're going to see that, and that wasn't there, right?
Right. But I mean, even in the initial autopsy, they note that the anterior strap muscles, so both sides. So when I think of a camera strap or something, I think of it getting one side and causing a problem. I don't think there's any way to get that twisted so that it does both sides.
Right, but there's no damage to his skin.
No damage to his skin.
That's what I'm getting at, is because if you think about like how like imagine someone cutting somebody's airway off, okay? And you see how they put their hand on their neck and they kind of push up, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what's bruising.
Right.
Okay, well, anything besides a hand doing that is going to leave evidence of itself behind on the skin.
Right.
Like an indentation or something. Your hand can do it just bruising those in the muscles inside.
Correct.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Okay, and so to me, that's a definitive point. The only thing that might be relevant that, you know, if it was a completely separate incident where somebody tried to cut off his airway at a different point in time and he still had bruises left from that, they were not successful in cutting off his airway.
Correct.
Okay, and so that's important to note because that isn't. They were attempting to do it. They weren't strong enough to actually, you know, because it's really hard to manually strangle somebody, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know what the circumstances were, but they stopped doing that for whatever reason.
Either because they couldn't complete it, or because it wasn't having the effect they wanted, or they thought they were done.
Sure. And then, or they got the bright idea to just put them in the water, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But to me, that almost definitively rules out it not involving another person.
It does. It really does. And I try to take the accident scenarios far enough to like did he get hit by a snowplow and it was on a bridge? And when the plow made a second pass, it like pushed him over. None of them account for the strap muscle injuries, no matter what I did. And these injuries are not small. Okay, they extend from the hyoid bone to the arch of the aorta, is how it's described by the initial medical examiner's report in this case.
Right. Not to mention that anytime someone's hit by a car or a snowplow or whatever, if you look at a person standing in front of the vehicle, there's going to be a range of area that's going to be hit and sustain injuries, right?
Yep.
And
these injuries are concentrated
on his head. He doesn't have a mark on the rest of his body.
Well, he has injuries to his legs that are post-mortem, but you're right. Other than that.
Okay, yes. Other than that, there's no indication that he had any pre-mortem injuries like that a car hitting him would cause.
Right.
He doesn't have any of that. So to get hit by a car, you actually have to get hit by the car, and there's always going to be evidence of that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no injury to the lower extremities. There's no injuries to the neck, the chest, the pelvis. They didn't indicate there were any fractures to legs, arms, anything. So that's where we end up just in terms of the autopsy reports, like that's where we end up coming to this conclusion that we don't feel like any of this at all lends towards suicide. It's a huge stretch to get it towards accidental.
Just to be clear, I don't feel like I don't even feel like when his body was dumped that it was dumped from a height. If that helps with that whole situation there. There's no indication in the autopsy that there was more to it than the severe beating that another person did to him. Because, there's speculation that he fell and that's what caused all those head wounds.
Right, but instead, it's more like somebody walked to the water's edge and dropped them in.
I'm saying I don't even feel like somebody dropped him off a height to get him into the water. So that's where I stand on that. So that, to me, would make it impossible for it to have been accidental, because you're going to have that distance of falling for it to be an accident, right?
Yes.
And to me, that's not what happened. There would be other things present if he had fallen from a height.
I'll tell you one thing that was in here that I was not familiar with before. Have you ever heard of the word hypermobile?
Yes.
I did not. They state in here the neck is not hypermobile. And I had to go hunting quite a bit to look that up. But they also, in the same sentence, say the neck is not hypermobile and shows an injury to be described. And that is what put me on to the strap muscles and that laceration that you pointed out. And I think that being as big as it was, do you think that was made? Did you get any information from here that let you know if that was made perimortem or postmortem?
Which thing?
The laceration to the neck.
The laceration to the neck is made before he was killed because it has a 3 by 2 inch contusion around it.
That's the conclusion I came to too.
And that is indicative of a 1 inch blade being shoved into his neck, and it's being shoved so hard that when the balled fist around the handle of the knife hits the side of the neck, it is making a 3 by 2 bruise.
Yeah.
Measure your fist.
Yep.
Okay. Holding the knife the way, because I presume that after this awful beating, after trying to cut off his airway, and then this was sort of a last-ditch type of effort. Now, keep in mind, there is no indication on the autopsy report that that's what this is.
Correct.
Okay, there's a lacerated pharynx, and there's notation of a 1-inch laceration on the left side of his neck that has a 3x2 contusion around it. And I have come to my own conclusion about this. Okay. Now, it's a little bit out of my ability to really kind of deal with as far as like, being squeamish about stuff. I didn't see where a pharynx could be lacerated externally.
You make a good point there.
Well, that's what led to all this. And, what is making the lacerations? Because, a laceration in an autopsy report indicates a soft force injury that has disrupted the skin. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
All right. And so it's not an abrasion, right? It's not a scrape. It's a situation where you've got an opening. And if you think about it, most of us, I don't think even have any idea, like, what it would be like to hit somebody with a baseball bat and have them have a gaping wound from that. Right.
Right.
Okay. And so, I had to really think this through. The 1-inch laceration, it's kind of hard to come up with what that is.
It is.
And so coupled with the lacerated pharynx inside, like the example I gave, or I guess another good one would be if you're brushing your teeth and you fell and your toothbrush was in your mouth and you fell face first. The direction your toothbrush goes is that's how a pharynx gets lacerated, right?
Correct.
Okay. And the only reason I say it that way is because that's what you're looking at as far as an external laceration. There was no indication any of that happened.
Right. So I went looking for not just lacerations, because that's actually difficult to find. Like a pharynx or a pharyngeal laceration is actually complex to separate out and find like another reason for it. But I did find perforations, like different types of perforation. Not a lot. They're actually them happening in a situation that doesn't involve two people hurting each other is really rare. Like it can happen from blunt external neck trauma, but it's exactly like you've described so far. The most common type of pharyngeal lacerations actually occur during
car accidents,
and secondarily, it is during medical procedures.
With the
different
breathing tube?
Yeah, breathing tubes and other instrumentations. Those are the most common types of like pharyngeal perforations. Yeah, injuries. But they can occur during falls and blows to the neck. They're just very, very rare. And it usually where you read about it is children. Now, I did narrow it down to what you're describing: toothbrushes, lollipops, things like that during a fall. Frequently calls that in children, sometimes adults. But the next...
Adults fall less with lollipops in their mouth.
Right. But trauma to the larynx coming from a blow to the neck is actually third on the list. And it's rare. All of these things are
larynx laceration or a pharynx laceration?
Both, actually. Pharyngeal, and it's third on both. It's a blow to the neck. But you have to understand, like when I say that, I think I read 11 total cases have been recorded by 2010 of pharyngeal perforation. And so you're not talking dozens of things that you can read about. You're literally reading about 4 car accidents, 3 medical procedures. So you're already at 7 out of the 11. And the others are individual like instances. Does that make sense? I think one was a hockey injury.
Yeah, no, I've looked at all that information you're talking about. I was led to understanding, based on the autopsy report, he had a lacerated pharynx. That seemed really weird to me.
It is weird.
I start putting together the other things that are called out in the autopsy to try and figure out how that happened, right?
Yeah.
It did not seem plausible that the strap muscle bruising would have led to the lacerated pharynx, just based on everything I put together. But he does have this laceration that's an inch on his the left side of his neck that has a big contusion around it. So that happened because it has a contusion around it. That means it happened before he died. Because in order for a contusion to appear on the body, the blood has to be pumping, the heart has to be working, right?
Right.
And that's how they can tell that the places on his legs are post-mortem, meaning after he died, because it's just straight up gouges, right?
Correct.
There's no sign of any sort of bruising or anything else that you would find in the event his heart had been pumping at the time that those injuries were made. And so all of the stuff that happens to all of his injuries, except for the two on his legs, are made before he dies, in my opinion. There has been speculation about him falling. I don't think he fell from anywhere. I feel like he was put in the water. And
Yeah.
and while that to me, that takes a lot of this equation out of it, right? I don't know why he was associated with a fall immediately, except that explains, like, because you think, well, if he fell head first, that could explain some of the injuries, except the way his injuries were. This is somebody with a blunt force object, and they're hitting like multiple places on his head that would not be hit in a singular fall, right?
Right.
Like, it wouldn't be possible.
Yeah. So the way that these injuries line up, like, I can account for chunks of them, but all of them happening together, like, the only thing that even came close, I found one instance that was recorded and sort of talked about where someone had everything but the strap muscle injuries in a car accident as the driver of a car who had collided with something that object then hit the steering wheel, and the steering wheel and the object hit the person.
Right, but we don't have any evidence that he was in a car, that
Right.
like, all that stuff would come into play, right? And, if he was in a car accident and he sustained the injuries we're talking about, he would have at least had a seatbelt strap across his chest.
Right. He would have had the marks that are, like, he doesn't have the rest of the injuries, if that makes sense. Like, he has some injuries that don't line up with it, but he doesn't have the rest of the injuries that you typically associate with that person. Like, even if there is no seatbelt involved, there are other injuries that happen to you when you're in that type of car accident that are visible on your naked body at autopsy.
Right, exactly. And it would have been, there's other things that would come into play, like, I don't know, a wrecked vehicle that had blood.
Yep.
And none of that has happened, right? Like, none of that comes into play here with the situation as it unfolded.
Correct. And that's how we, ultimately, like, when people are going to ask, like, how do you end up on, like, knowing for sure it's more likely than not a homicide? This is the path that we take to get there.
Right. And I am not completely against learning how you could have bruising on the straps of your neck, the anterior strap muscles, indicating that it was caused by something different, along with some of the other injuries he suffered. I'm not saying that there's absolutely no way that could happen. It's just, in the painstaking research I've done, which it is very painstaking, this is the most logical conclusion, because it does take, and it actually makes sense, because you think about putting your thumb and your finger on somebody's neck to try and cut off their airway. I mean, I don't think about that very often, but that's where that bruising's coming from, the pressure that's being put there.
Yep. Yeah, I wish there was a Columbo moment in all of this where somebody could say such and such was left-handed and that means he did this. It just doesn't, we don't really land there because we're missing some of this story and some of the information. But this is how we get from the first autopsy report through the second pathology report to looking at it all and concluding that until homicide is ruled out or some very interesting type of accident is shown, that basically someone killed Jay Polhill and they haven't been brought to justice.
Right. And that's what I don't understand. And, maybe there's a reason. Maybe I have completely misunderstood how anatomy works and how, pathology works. I don't think that's the case. I feel like that it's pretty spot on, actually.
Yeah.
And it's disappointing. It's a little disappointing, honestly, for it to go through like what it went through. And I'm not saying that this is the case, but I can imagine a lack of wanting to, deal with this case could have occurred. That's how I can see it being a situation where it's undetermined. This is just one of those very clear-cut cases to me. And I hope somebody can actually look at it and explain to me why it wasn't. That would make me feel better. Because if I can see it, certainly everybody else on Earth can see it.
That's what you would think. And yet here we are.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But I would love for a doctor to be like, this is why you don't understand that this is an undetermined death. And to give me the explanation that actually explains how Jay Polhill had these bruises on his anterior strap muscles, and it is not indicative of manual strangulation. That's all they have to tell me, really, because the rest of them could be attributed to something besides somebody else's hand, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's different instruments that I looked through a couple of different things, like knives, using the hilt of a knife to do some of these injuries, and then the tip of the knife for other injuries, and then I looked at certain things that you find in your car. I looked at a lug nut wrench. I looked at a number of different things that you could hit someone with. And I didn't land on any particular thing being more likely than another, but I realized that if I hear a story, if you got a suspect sitting there telling me a story, I'll know what's not BS because they'll tell me about something that makes sense for these injuries.
One thing about this particular case is there was a flurry of blows to the head. And so I don't know that that's going to be... I feel like the first hit was probably planned, and then the rest... I don't know. This is how I imagine the situation. It's me trying to hit something like a mouse with a baseball bat, right? And I miss it, and I keep heading back, forth. I'm trying to get it. And so that's immediately where my mind goes, right? I understand this is a human being, right? But that's how I imagine these blows happening. Sort of the pattern of the back and forth between them, right? They were vicious and they were unrelenting, and they did not kill him. He was unable to fight back, though.
Well, if you ask me to sit down and determine what I'm asking an expert to explain to me is, I think what I see here is I see the first blow renders him unconscious. And I think the blows after that are out of frustration and anger, not knowing that he's unconscious. For whatever reason, I do agree with the flurry of blows happening. I think the first one knocks him out, and the rest are overkill because you've got probably a number of things going on with an offender doing something like this. But I think that ultimately, once that first blow happens, I think he's out. And that's why you have 0 defensive wounds of any kind. I think that's your proof there. And that's what I want an expert to confirm for me. And that's probably what I want the suspect to confirm for me when I'm talking to him.
Next time on True Crime XS.
I cannot believe how much the Department of Corrections in Illinois protects the records of these inmates. It's very interesting to me. And I'm actually going after... So he's got a probation officer named Will Smith. And he had him for the bank robberies, and I'm hoping that guy will come on and talk to me because I found him talking about another Chicago incident. I was like, well, maybe I can get him. He was actually a lot younger than I realized he would be. It's only been 14 years, but I was thinking if I could get him to come on and talk to me, I'd like to know why this guy bails. So right after Jay's death, something happens where he comes into probation for his probation check-in, parole check-in. He's been in prison for a really long time. And the probation and parole officer, he makes the decision to add mental health counseling to what's going on with this guy. So he had to have come in and said something. So there's that to think about.
In talking to everybody about the suspect themselves, people had plans where we should go get his jail calls from particular times. 2 different people mentioned that to me, and I tried to get them. I don't know if that's even a possibility. He has some family, and I've started reaching out to his family. I reached out to him directly. He's indicated he wants to have a conversation with me, but I don't think he's going to like what I have to say, so we'll see if that goes any further. Well, now I feel like an idiot because I missed a bunch of stuff. We got to go back and talk to Jay's mom again. So here's the kind of the takeaway. This is the third person that's mentioned something kind of in this vein. Some of this stuff is potentially evidence of sexual assault. So keep that in mind. That's just a weird road to go down, and I have absolutely no proof. The reason I bring that up is because I've been talking to the suspect, and I thought about this, and I don't know if it'll work, but we had an investigator that was going to work with us that was kind of conflicted out because they have a contract related to that area. I don't want to go into the whole thing, but something they said really stuck with me. Even underwater, the shirts might retain DNA in a way that we could go look at it. But this is the other thing that was said to me today. Third person that said this. What if the post-mortem injuries are not anything to do with a boat? So the idea was, what if the dumping the body in the river was a last-minute thing? And what was actually going on there was this guy was trying to dispose of the body by cutting it up. And I missed these things. I missed the potential assault evidence. I missed the potential body disposal evidence. And I feel kind of dumb about that. But I think we can go back and kind of put all this together. The other thing that has come up is there was a plea deal offered in this case. That's crazy to me. Okay, it's a serious crime. This guy is in prison for sure. But the plea deal goes out, and it's between 2 different county assistant state's attorneys. And for some reason, they don't want to close this case out. They feel like they have him cold on this other case. But even one of the investigators who finally, he reached back out to me. I don't think he wanted to talk to me at first. He was very nice. He actually has a very good take on all of this. And he confirmed some of the things that I've, been thinking. Look, there was a plea deal here. This guy was going to plea out to this, and I would love to know how real that is. I don't know if any of these assistant state's attorneys are going to call me back on it. I was just curious because it blew up at the last second, and this guy gets sentenced to years and years and years in prison for something else. But this was going to be part of it. But I think the idea was maybe the evidence was a little weaker here. It really bothers me that happened. Oh, and check this out. This guy is got a link to Odinism. And that's something that recently came up in another case, and people have been kind of running with that theory. Not heathenism, not not all of the things that are good, but the Odinism part, the prison part. This guy's linked to that. And then I thought about it. I went back and looked through his booking stuff. His tattoos are all Viking. So I was like, maybe that's a thing.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabrottieCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
You fall like in your expectations.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, you can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.